Thank you very much, Justice Mangatal. Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the first session of the Jamaica International Arbitration Center's online conference on dispute management in a new world. And of course, that new world is staged against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it is useful to make a couple of remarks, but let me first introduce myself. I am Milton Samuda. I'm the managing partner of Samuda and Johnson Attorneys at Law in Jamaica. And I've been in practice for more years than I care to remember, 33 of those being in the areas of admiralty and commercial law. When I was thinking about the topics under this session, it seemed to me that the global pandemic has caused us to rethink what is normal, and therefore what are normal operations. I think the two words that we have all heard is unprecedented and the phrase new normal. The disruption to business and to supply chains has been sharp, fundamental, and pervasive. And in that context, the astute management of the inevitable disputes that will arise, especially where force majeure clauses are weak or non-existent, becomes an imperative. So colleagues, it's against that background, as well as the 40-year celebration of the UN's Convention on Contracts for International Sale of Goods, that we are meeting. From my point of view, perhaps one simple point is missed in many fora in which dispute resolution is discussed. And that point is that true and effective dispute resolution commences before there is a dispute. It considers how negotiations are conducted, how contracts are drafted, how the performance of contractual obligations is monitored, and how contextual and external environments are constantly assessed for threats. So at this time, when we are desperate to extract positives from our current nightmare, the prompt to do things differently, to be better prepared, to collaborate on solutions is one of those positives. The flexibility and adaptability of CISG is another, and we will hear more about that, I am sure, during the rest of the day. For now, and with those brief remarks, I want to turn to a quick introduction of our distinguished panelists. And let me first start with an apology for absence from Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones, who your program says Jamaica, but she's in fact of the Bahamas, but stationed in Jamaica. And Therese is the general manager of IDB's country department group. She's unavoidably absent, sends her apologies, really wanted to be here, but something urgent has arisen. And in fact, we have not been able to get a replacement from IDB because of that urgency. We also have with us, or should have with us in a short while, I just saw apologies for lateness, the Honorable Floyd Green, State Minister in the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries in Jamaica, and Member of Parliament for Southwest St. Elizabeth. Floyd was previously State Minister in the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, with specific responsibility for youth portfolio. And he will bring us his particular perspective given his portfolio responsibilities. We also have Dr. Eric Deans, CEO of Jamaica Special Economic Zone Authority and Chairman of Jamaica's Logistics Hub Task Force. Eric is a member of the Chartered Institute of Transport of the UK and an Associate Professor in Logistics and Supply Chain Sustainability at the Caribbean Maritime University. So in looking at business continuity and supply chain logistics, we might miss the sort of multilateral perspective which Therese would have brought to the table. But if Jose is still with us, perhaps I can lean on him during the Q&A to help us get that perspective. With those brief remarks, let me ask Dr. Deans to lead off, and he will be speaking in part about the survival of businesses and households, knowing how to navigate disruptions, and the whole issue of medical devices and personal protection equipment coming through those supply chains which have been disrupted. Dr. Deans?
Thank you, Milton. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and I'll just go right into it. So we have noticed in recent months that the pandemic has severed global and domestic supply chains, affecting innumerable companies, industries, and goods. Medical devices and personal protection equipment, for example, which are critical to combating the coronavirus and protecting the lives and livelihoods of workers, have been caught up in this interruption. Also, agricultural goods, manufactured goods, and even going to a restaurant. This will undoubtedly lead to disputes arising from contract breaches, either from suppliers unable to fill orders, or purchasers unable to accept deliveries, or transport intermediaries just unable to perform due to the unavailability of staff or government curfews. COVID-19 is therefore taking a huge toll on supply chains, from suppliers to end customers. According to the World Investment Report, the impact of COVID-19 on foreign direct investment will be severe, an estimated 30 to 40% decline this year, and new gaps will emerge, which is where opportunities lie. The survival of business and household depends on knowing how to navigate. Yes, we are witnessing government policies towards FDI evolving increasingly in the form of a return to protectionist policies, increased screening measures for mergers and acquisitions, and a general trend towards nationalist investment policies in the stated interest of national security, food security, or increasingly public health security. As the SED authority, we are responsible for regulating special economic zones. Therefore, I will speak on the reorganization and differentiation of special economic zones in the post-COVID world, and how we in Jamaica can capitalize on specific opportunities. The inherent vice of long supply chains is that they are more susceptible to disruptions. Hence, post-COVID-19, we will see a shift towards what is known as nearshoring in regional hubs that have the requisite capacity in logistics, in manufacturing, in distribution, and indeed value-added services. Now, we know that Jamaica is blessed with a strategic location with respect to global maritime and aviation trade routes. Through enhancements of our existing and planned special economic zones, the country is addressing the shortage of goods globally and disruptions of global supply chains. We're looking at ways to capture and boost global trade. It is noted that air travel will take a long time to recover. This means that trade will start to depend even more on maritime logistics, thereby opening up large opportunities for new SEZ, special economic zones, such as Caymanas, among others. At the SEZ Authority, we understand the nature of infrastructure that is necessary in the post-COVID environment, and what pool of capital is remaining after economies recover, and what is needed for survival of small and large enterprises. We have identified how we can take advantage of labor, of capital, of technology in creating original investments. We are leveraging Jamaica's regional ties to determine how we can serve our regional partners better. We understand that in light of Jamaica's national investment policy, the Caymanas SEZ needs to address, and other SEZs need to address how we improve not only our competitive position, but of our neighbors as well. So we see that service value addition in manufacturing is becoming massively important as manufacturing costs are declining, with things such as automation and the Internet of Things, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. The competitive edge that we will have in our Jamaican zones can provide servicing models that stem from policy environments that are flexible, low cost, and address enterprises that are interested in exporting and competing in a global marketplace. The recent World Investment Report I mentioned previously states that services related to the digital economy are attracting the most FDI, while manufacturing is not as represented. The new SEZ model that is emerging all over the world considers special economic zones as being very important economic indicators by governments, particularly in developing countries. More focused investments are required to attract specific industries, and the kind of activities we're seeing are in areas such as biotech and pharmaceutical, whether it is the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or finished products. Successful SEZs must be able to access major conglomerates and industry activities and provide facilities for investors. But it's important to know that as we take measures to enhance legal trade, we create opportunities for illicit trade. So transparency and data access have become key consideration for investors in special economic zones. Issues such as intellectual property infringement and counterfeiting, for example, in prescription drugs and luxury goods, are major threats within special economic zones. Digital record keeping is becoming the gold standard for good transactions. In the SEZ space, we benefit from collaboration with our other zones across the world. It's important to note that 30% of global trade takes place between zones. So in closing, I just want to say that an appropriate regulatory framework, including arbitration and dispute resolution mechanisms, are key to addressing the issues that arise from legal and illicit trade. Digital record keeping or transparency is often the first step, and information needs to be shared between operators and SEZ authorities. We must develop rules-based trading systems by doing the appropriate research so that we can remodel our zones. So when it comes to business continuity in a globalized world, we believe Jamaica's special economic zones will play a pivotal role. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dean. I noticed that much of your presentation seems underpinned by the technological necessities of dealing with some of the things that you have outlined. And I presume that we can get to explore that in the Q&A. But in the short time you had, you really painted a wide picture, and we'll explore that in greater detail. I noticed that Mr. Taylor is with us, and bearing in mind that the minister has not yet joined us, apparently he's still in a meeting. I would just ask Mr. Taylor to unmute and give him the opportunity of bringing his greetings now in the context of this particular panel. And if the minister doesn't join us, we'll go straight into Q&A. Mr. Taylor?
Thank you so much. Again, apologies for being late. I really had this scheduled, but some unforeseen circumstance came up and I wasn't able to make it on time. But with that being said, I'm here. I really want to send greetings from the Construction Industry Council. We believe that dispute resolution is a very important topic, especially as it relates to the pandemic that we are facing. And so I know for our members, we are looking forward to everything that will be discussed at this time. So thank you all for having us. Thank you for inviting us. And we are very excited about this session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. Colleagues, the whole notion of ensuring that, especially in light of catastrophic events, business continues is something that the Caribbean in particular and other SIDS understand all too well. Our training, of course, comes from the background of hurricanes and to a lesser extent earthquakes. But that type of disruption, fundamental, pervasive, sometimes heartbreaking, as in last year and the year before, has put us in a unique position, I think, to understand the implications of deep-seated disruptions in business and supply chains. And what I would like to do now in the question and answer session is to explore with you in greater detail, using perhaps the presentation of Dr. Deans as the initial background, how it is that we address these twin realities. Business continuity, making sure that despite disruption, business continues and the economy continues. And the restoration of supply chains which have been savaged. So colleagues, the floor, so to speak, is now open. And if you just indicate to me, I will recognize you and we can commence the Q&A. Jose, at the risk of being accused of laying hands on you suddenly, we missed from this panel the multilateral perspective that we were hoping that Therese would have brought, given her incumbency at the IDB and her prior experience at the International Monetary Fund. But from the sort of UNCITRAL perspective, is there anything that you might want to bring to our attention in relation to the challenge of business continuity and maintaining supply chains during events like COVID? I've seen a question from Alexandra, and I think Gashar Moller also from Ethiopia wanted to ask a question. But in the meantime, Dr. Dean, the whole issue of maintaining supply chains, of course, operates at two levels, if not more. You're talking about maintaining the international supply chains that moves goods and services between countries. But there would have also been disruptions in local supply chains, which we saw affecting particularly our farmers. Would you care to give us your insight in that regard?
Thank you, Milton. So there were disruptions that occurred both on the international level and domestically. And I'll give you an example of some of the things that happened in the SEZ space, which we did from a business continuity perspective. And maybe the participants in this conference can look at where conflicts can arise in some of these instances, not just as it relates to suppliers and consumers, but also to the workers involved in carrying out those activities. So we had a situation where the government imposed certain curfews and quarantines. In one case for an entire parish of St. Catherine, and prevented the movement of people during daylight and nighttime hours. As a result, businesses in the special economic zones, in order to continue their operations, were required to implement what was known as work from home initiatives. What that meant was workers were allowed to perform their activities from home just as if they were in the office. For that to happen, you needed to ensure that they had their proper equipment, they had the appropriate internet services at home, and the appropriate security measures were in place to prevent access by illegal operators to the information that was being transferred. So in that situation, from an SEZ perspective, there had to be mechanisms put in place to allow, for example, companies in the BPO space to move equipment which came in duty-free, to leave the special economic zones and go to the workers' homes. There had to be mechanisms put in place to protect the information of the customers. We also saw that the activities taking place in the zones had tremendous impact. So what I was saying was that the operations within the SEZs had to continue under a work from home initiative approved by the government. As such, that allowed financial institutions, that allowed companies that were providing essential services, both to domestic companies and international companies, to continue. The risks that were faced, particularly by the workers, was in any instance where they would have resulted in any loss or damage to the equipment that they carried home, or if there were any information breaches that occurred that would affect the client's relationships of the companies practicing the work from home operations. But in terms of business continuity, we saw that by implementing the work from home strategy, which is a digital strategy, it enabled certain operations to continue. But however, we have to bear in mind that everything is not just services. Goods still had to move. So mechanisms had to be put in place to ensure that the goods that were required to move were still allowed to move.
As you talk about that, Dr. Dean, one of the questions from Yannick Russell is, are there any plans for Jamaica to ratify the CISG? I don't know if from where you sit, you could speak to that. Perhaps that is a question that would have been directed to Delroy. But are you aware?
No, I'm not aware of what steps are being placed, but it's something that we would support. I think the minister would be in better position to respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, if Minister Green is able to come on, then I will direct that question to him. Perhaps he might be better able to give us an answer here. And Judith, you had made a point in the chat.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I could with pleasure. The only issue is that I'm not sure that I understood the question correctly because the line is very bad. So I only understood half. So if I did understand correctly, and that's the point I wanted to make, CSG is having in principle a long-term perspective. And this was the view of having an international contract. If you want to, so the contract is kept as a contract as long as possible, because it's so difficult to unwind in international contract to send it back. You have transport costs again. You have to go through customs again. So you have all these elements. And that's why the CSD is providing different solutions than normally national contracts would.
Okay. Thank you very much for that intervention, Judith. I have a question from Crystal Maharaj from Trinidad and Tobago. She's the legal officer in the Office of Procurement Regulation. Her question is, to avoid any unnecessary litigation or disruption and incurring monetary losses regarding agreements and contracts with suppliers and contractors, should the buyer ask the supplier if there is a pandemic preparedness contingency plan in place, or if he or she has dedicated resources for responding to disruptions generally and COVID-19 specifically? Eric, or any other panelists, your thoughts?
Well, I think in the new normal, these are things that will have to be examined, and we would have to look at, well, entities will have to look at how they incorporate such provisions in their contracts and operations. This pandemic and the disruptions that have occurred, the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions we have experienced has brought to light the need for a closer look at the provisions that we put in supply contracts. And I think the suggestion made in the question are things that would need to be examined and implemented in future contracts going forward.
One of the points that had been alluded to by Chairperson Justice Mangatal in her opening remarks was the whole question of force majeure and how that has been looked at given the crisis of COVID-19. Of course, that's one of the clauses that lawyers wrestle with from time to time in commercial contracts. Again, while I may be accused of laying hands on people suddenly, I notice that we have in our midst Dancia Penn, an outstanding attorney at law from the BVI and former Attorney General, in fact, from the BVI. I don't know if Dancia would wish to give us a perspective so that I don't monopolize the conversation.
Good morning, Milton. Good morning to you.
Hi, Dancia. Sorry to lay hands on you suddenly. I was going to...
And to the distinguished panel, you're rightly accused, Milton, of laying hands on people. And you certainly look in that regard. But thank you very much. And I'm delighted to participate in today's conference. And I compliment my friend, Dr. Chris Malcolm, and everyone who's been involved in the organizing of this very important virtual conference. I think the topic that is under discussion is one that is of fundamental importance. And I think particularly for the Caribbean, not just Jamaica, but the whole Caribbean region, we at the world, it's a global experience. We have all been very much impacted by the disruptions in the supply chain. I agree with the comment that Judith, who I haven't met before, I agree very much with the comment that Judith made. And I think the others spoken before have also touched on some of the very key issues that now exist, issues that are going to continue to evolve in this new world. So I think this discussion and the discussions that are to come in the course of the day are extremely timely, and it is important that all of us, and it is really a tremendous thing that we have such a wide group of participants from all over the world. I think it is important that we have these kinds of encounters and conversations and discussions, that we identify the issues, and that together we continue to work, improve on them, and to face them. That's a very general comment, Milton. I plan to say more when I have the honor of being on the panel with Mr. Stoppy, who I can see, and others later in the course of this program. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, sir. I think that one of the things, of course, just from the narrow legal perspective, is that force majeure clauses are now likely to be wider and more detailed. If Derek McCoy has been listening, I would be interested to get his perspective on it. Derek, Minister sent yet another message saying that he is trying to connect. He's not sure what the challenge is, but I think we'll have to give up on that effort. We are now 8 minutes shy of our deadline. If there are any other questions, I see a hand up. Let me just see who that is. And it is in fact the minister. Minister, if you're hearing me, what I'm going to suggest that you do is join by phone. And let us see if we can pick you up. Remain on screen, but join by phone and let us see if we can pick you up. Colleagues, one of the things in relation to business continuity that I know has given some of the companies with which I'm associated a problem is a really robust technological response. Part of that consideration underpinned the presentation made by Dr. Dean. I don't know if there is anyone who would care to comment on that. I also have a question from Razor Roker. Nora comment says, I believe we need to make specific agreements, not only in the private sector, but also public. Elaborate economy policies that are accurate in our local economy. Also, we can work in the 2030 agenda. So panelists can consider that comment in their remarks. And Chris, if you want to say a word about financing, please come in right after.
Yes, thanks, Milton. Now, one of the things I'm sure that Therese would have looked at was the area of business supply and the importance of financing in the supply chain arrangement. And one of the things we sometimes fail to understand is the extent to which finance is itself a supply chain logistics issue. And what is happening more and more now, we have seen instances of the banks, for example, we saw recently enough where one of the big banks in the US went and they had instances of calling a significant number of mortgages and other instances where, of course, the banks which finance being critical to the supply chain are coming under more and more stress. Persons not being able to work, persons not being able to have their contracts honored and so on. And the question is, how is financing to be dealt with there? And what special arrangements, if any, must the multilaterals, banking at local level and so on, put in place, recognizing that if financing is not flowing, then businesses will ultimately have no option but to fail. And that is an area I think we're going to have to, with legislative intervention perhaps as well, look seriously at to ensure that as we seek to spur the economy and as we seek to get businesses up and running again, that we take such measures. Some of them may be temporary, others may have to be of a more permanent nature, put in place to make sure that people have available money. Because at the end of the day, business typically runs around money. And if it is not flowing, it's not available, then as night follows day, you're going to end up with insolvencies and end up with businesses going under, which is the last thing we want to happen in the environment we're in. So I would certainly wish to, and Eric, I'm sure could speak to it from his perspective in the logistics chain, what he is seeing in terms of monies going into the supply chain that he's intimately involved in, and the extent to which persons are keeping out of financing supply chain at the time, okay. Logistics.
Before Eric comes in, isn't one of the necessary implications from what you have said, Chris, the need to look or to relook at catastrophic insurance?
It is, you know, and that perhaps is one of the solutions that we're going to have to look at. And I know in the context of the Caribbean, we have for many years been trying to develop effective policies and arrangements to deal particularly with our hurricane situation. But we now have crises of another, or crisis of another nature, and I'm sure there will be others, which now causes us to do exactly what you're saying, to ensure that we have much more effective general catastrophic insurance arrangements in place that can deal with us and help us through these periods, particularly for small and more vulnerable businesses.
Yeah. And that, in fact, would be part of the arrangement and regime, I think, that Reza was referring to in her comments about the policies that are, the word she used, accurate in our local economy. Because especially in this neck of the woods, in the Caribbean, that is something that you know, happens with fair frequency, unfortunately. So, but Eric, you were going to respond to a comment.
Yes. So, just to close the loop on a comment that you had made about force majeure.
Yes.
I think that is an issue that is going to gain more importance going forward. And tying it back into, as you say, catastrophic insurance is going to also play a part. But one of the impacts that will have is that it's going to be more and more costly to do business because of the costs associated with those provisions, those force majeure provisions, and the insurance that is required to protect. But one of the things that we're also seeing coming out of this COVID-19 is that certain businesses, certain investment companies, houses and banks are stalling, providing financing on unplanned projects. That also has a disruptive effect going forward. And that has broad impacts on a range of stakeholders, which also need to be factored in.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now, well, we're almost at 11. So unfortunately, I will have to bring this session to an end. Sorry about the technical difficulties. It's one of the things that, having been participating in a number of international webinars, everybody is wrestling with. Minister Green indicated to me that he has been listening, wasn't able to connect audio. So I'm going to ask him to give a response in the chat to the question as to whether Jamaica has plans to deal with the CISG. And I just need to thank Dr. Deans. He ended up batting alone, a very difficult thing to do in a game of cricket.
Yes.
But we thank you for your presentation. Thank Dancer and Judith for jumping in and helping to flesh out some of the points that were made.